And then our third and final speaker of the morning session is somebody who comes home, basically. Michael McOsker earned his PhD from the University of Michigan a couple of years ago. He's currently a papyrology researcher at University College London, and his work focuses on literary and Herculaneum papyrology, Greek stylistics, and the reception of Greek thought by the Romans. And the title of... Okay.
Yeah.
He's going to talk about what these roles are all about, so that's important. Please welcome Dr. McOsker.
Thank you. After David spoke about taking the roles apart and Federica talked about putting them back together again, I'm going to talk about what's actually in them. So the printing press was apparently invented in Korea in the 14th century. It quickly made its way to Europe, as we see from the papers related to a lawsuit filed in Strasbourg in 1439, which shows that Johannes Gutenberg and associates were printing books in Europe. Around 1471, the first book in Greek was printed. Appropriately, it was an elementary grammar called the Erotemata by Emmanuel Chrysolaris. The invention of the printing press is paradoxically a watershed moment in the history of ancient Greek and Latin literature. Before printing, classical texts had to be copied by hand, a time-consuming and painstaking task that in the end only produced one copy. Even worse, this copy would have errors in the text. Even the best trained, most diligent scribe cannot copy a relatively lengthy text perfectly. The production of a single book was therefore expensive and imperfect. The invention of the printing press changed all that. The difficulties of producing books in antiquity, the medieval period, and the Renaissance go a long way towards explaining why so much of classical literature is lost. A full account of the causes, among them economic collapse, a sharp decline in literature, the increasing difficulty and apparent irrelevance of old literature, the rise and dominance of Christianity, is well beyond my ability to summarize, especially in half an hour. But that loss of so much classical literature is the background to my talk today, which is what we have found so far in the library of the Villa of the Papyri. None of the books in the library have come to us by the normal manuscript route. As we heard from David Blank, Camillo Pederni began to open scrolls shortly after their discovery, and then Father Antonio Piaggio invented the machina, which allowed them to be unrolled, at least in parts, rather than just cut apart. Since the uncertain relationship of inventory to ancient book has already been well described by Federica Nicolardi, I'll just remind you of that fact. Each ancient book is preserved in a number of inventories, from 1 to, say, about 15 or so. Here is a bit of a chart about the inventory numbers there in the left column, assigned to each book of Philodemus's On Poems. So here you can see that parts of 7 inventory numbers go into making On Poems Book 1. So the 1,838 inventory numbers in the current inventory combine to form a significantly smaller number of books. These books were scrolls of papyrus, as we have seen. Papyrus is a reed native to the Nile area. You can make a sort of paper, also called papyrus, out of it. Sheets of papyrus were then glued together into rolls in the factory and sold. For shorter texts, writers could just write into the roll and cut off the bit that they needed. Longer texts would fill up a whole roll, or 2 rolls glued together as the writer preferred. Multi-volume works would usually be written across several rolls. Philodemus's 10-book-long On Vices would normally consist of 10 rolls of papyrus. But sometimes a work was divided between 2, either because it was very long or because it wasn't important to fit it onto a single roll. So this is the end title of Philodemus On Poems Book 5, where you can see under the epsilon, which marks Book 5, a note saying that this work, this copy, has been divided into 2 volumes, and this is the 2nd volume. That's what the beta down here at the bottom with the line over it means. Authors and titles were usually listed at the beginning and end of a roll, and sometimes on tags that would have been readable without having to open the roll. You can see that here on this drawing of a relief. Because of the eruption and damage, none of those tags survived if they did exist, and initial titles are very rare. Sometimes the end titles are very bad. This is the end of Philodemus's On Anger, where you can just here at the bottom see a note about how long the book was. The title is preserved in an 18th century sketch, and the author is a modern attribution. Titles and authors can sometimes be ascribed on internal evidence or by cross-references, but not always. So when we can read it, that's best, but sometimes we can't. And that means that sometimes we don't know who wrote a book or who the author is. So first, a bird's eye view before we zoom in for details. The vast majority of the collection is in Greek. A couple dozen book rolls at most are in Latin. No other languages have been found, nor are they likely to be found. Of the Greek scrolls, the majority contain texts by Philodemus of Gadara, an Epicurean born on what's now the border between Israel and Jordan, who lived from about 110 BCE to 40 or so. Other Epicureans make up the bulk of the collection after Philodemus. The most important one is Epicurus himself. He was an Athenian citizen and the founder of the philosophical school. 5 rolls apparently contain Stoic texts, apparently all by Chrysippus, a very important early Stoic. There are no texts that we have found that belong to other philosophical schools. One work appears to be a history of Alexander the Great's successors. That's the only non-philosophical roll in Greek that's been found. A small residue of Latin texts have been found. Best understood is the Carmen de Bello Actiaco, or the poem on the Battle of Actium. That is some of that. At this battle, Octavian defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra and put them to flight. After a bit of mopping up action, he became the sole master of the Roman world. There is also a work of Roman history, the Histories of Seneca the Elder, in extraordinarily bad condition, unfortunately. All the other Latin papyri are too badly understood at this time to really say much about authorship or genre. There is good reason to believe that the collection is, or at least descends from, Philodemus's own working library. A few texts survive in more than one copy, and in some of these, scholars have argued that we have a draft and a final version of the same text. Philodemus's History of Plato's Academy is the best example of this. In P. Herc 1021, each section of text is written on its own sheet of papyrus, and then these were glued together. Normally, texts were written on pre-made rolls, as I said, without regard for the sheet joins. Further, there are additions written on the back of the roll with marks to show where they should be inserted into the text on the front of the roll. So the writer took notes on sheets of papyrus, then arranged them in order and glued them together, and then added more material to them. This is clearly a work in progress. And in fact, a second copy of the roll exists with all the bits in the right order. So we have a clean copy, a fair copy of it. Though Philodemus quite obviously read widely outside of other Epicureans, none of the works that he cites has been found in the library so far. This puzzle has not yet been solved and might have to do with the gap in time between Philodemus's death, maybe 40 BCE, and the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, a gap of around 120 years. Philodemus's patron was Lucius Calpurnius Piso Caesoninus, the father-in-law of Julius Caesar, and very probably the villa belonged to the Piso family. It may be that they only kept Philodemus's books and maybe some other Epicurean texts, because he had a personal connection to the family, but it is also possible that we have not found the villa's entire collection of books. I believe Richard is going to talk about that possibility later on. The oldest book in the collection contains a text by Epicurus on the topic of time. It was copied between 300 and 250 BCE, possibly during Epicurus's lifetime. Second oldest is a book by Mithridates of Lampsacus, Epicurus's best friend and second in command. The most recent ones date to the 1st century CE, only a few decades before the eruption of Vesuvius, but after Philodemus's death. This shows that the library continued to live, as it were. It was not a closed collection, but its owners added text to it even after Philodemus's lifetime. In short, we have a collection of mostly Epicurean material with a few Stoic texts and one historical one written in Greek, and a double handful of Latin texts, including a historical poem and a work of history, and quite a bit of unidentified material in both languages. The collection has some kind of close connection to Philodemus, who authored most of the texts that have been identified into it, but the exact details have not been recovered or reconstructed. If Philodemus himself assembled the library, a reasonable assumption, he had access to books that were already 200 years old during his lifetime, and others continued to add to the library after his death. So from here on, I will summarize what we know about the library in a bit more detail, and then conclude with a few guesses about what we're likely to find in the still rolled up books. The oldest texts in the library in terms of date of composition are those by Epicurus and his lieutenants in the running of the Epicurean school/community. We have 25 rolls that belonged to Epicurus's main work, the 37-book treatise on physics and psychology entitled On Nature. This is some of that, with a nice note in the margin. Not every book of the 37 books has been found, but multiple copies of some of them have been found. We certainly have book 2 and 2 copies of it, 9, 11, again in 2 copies, 14, 15, 21, 25. 25 is in 3 copies. 28 and 34. A book about the philosophy of time that I mentioned is attributed to Epicurus and might have been book 10. One other work by Epicurus entitled Echelaus has been found, and another on gifts and gratitude has been cautiously assigned to him. This is actually kind of surprising. Some titles that were famous in antiquity, like his Symposium and on the Goal, are missing from the collection. We would have expected a complete On Nature. If 3 copies of one book have been found, we might have expected that 3 copies of the whole work would have been there. We don't know whether this scattershot survival has to do with the accidents of the eruption and excavation, or if it's the result of library choices in the ancient world. If our finds accurately reflect the contents of the library in antiquity, why are some books missing and some present in more than one copy? Were these the most interesting or useful or controversial? And if so, when were they useful, controversial, or interesting? Understandably, we have fewer works by the other first-generation Epicureans. There are 2 book rolls by Mithridates, one entitled Paradoxes About Wealth, and a polemical work, perhaps, against the Sophists. Polyaenus' Against Aristo, an anti-Stoic work, and his Puzzles about geometry have both appeared, as have 2 of Colotes' polemical works against Plato's Lysis and against Plato's Euthydemus, but not, unfortunately, his book on the proposition that it is impossible to live pleasantly according to all the other philosophers. That was later the object of rebuttal by Plutarch. Nothing by Hermarchus has yet been identified in the collection, which is surprising because he was the leader of the school after Epicurus. Two works by Polystratus, another first-generation Epicurean, have been identified: On Philosophy, a work apparently intended to convince people to study Epicureanism, and a work in defense of normal people's beliefs about how the world works, entitled On Irrational Contempt for Popular Opinions. This was a defense of, again, normal people's beliefs against some odd, skeptical, revisionist views about the nature of things like shape and color and whether they really exist. All the authors that I've mentioned so far lived in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, but Philodemus was active in the 1st century BCE, leaving a gap that is not well filled with known authors. To this period, perhaps its beginning might belong Carneiscus, who wrote a biography of someone named Philistas. This was apparently intended to record an exemplary Epicurean life, perhaps as motivation for other Epicureans. At the end of this gap belong Zeno of Sidon, who was Philodemus' teacher, and Demetrius the Spartan, or Demetrius Laco. There are several treatises anonymous to us that might have been composed in the 3rd or 2nd centuries, but again, data on that is just, lacking so far. Demetrius is the 3rd most common author in the library after Philodemus and Epicurus. In fact, he was probably an older contemporary of Philodemus and wrote an On Poems. That's the end title of it, that I have spent quite a bit of time looking at. He also wrote 2 treatises on geometry, works on ethics, sense perception, and theology, and perhaps others. Zeno of Sidon was Philodemus' teacher and the head of the school in Athens at the start of the 1st century BCE. He also taught Cicero when Cicero spent time in Athens. One work by him on geometry has been identified in the collection. It has the splendid title, Reply to Craterus's book Against the Book on Geometrical Demonstrations, and was once described as the first extant reply to a hostile book review. Lastly, we come to Philodemus, the author of the most of the known books in the library. He was fond of writing multi-volume sets, such as his On Vices and Their Opposite Virtues, and his History of Philosophy, both of which were apparently in 10 volumes. Further, we have 7 of the 8 books of his On Rhetoric, and one of them, 4, is in 2 copies. We have bits of all 5 books of his On Poems. Again, one is in 2 copies. And we have the 4th book of his On Music, unless P. Herc Paris 4 turns out to be another volume of that, in which case we have 2. Likewise, we have On Death Volume 4, meaning we're missing at least 3, and On Methods of Inference 3, which mentions the work he's going to talk about next, so we're missing at least 1, 2, and 4 of that. Related in topic to inference is Philodemus's On the Sensations. Inference based on sense data is an important way of learning about the world in Epicurean science. Books 1 and 2 and 9 and 10 of the On Vices series survive, as well as one without a surviving number. It's conceivable that that series actually did go above 10. 4 or 6 books, depending on who you believe, of the history of philosophy are attested. The one on Plato's Academy is the one that I discussed earlier. We also have volumes on the Pre-Socratics, the Stoics, and Socrates and his followers. 2 books on the history of the Epicurean school may or may not belong to this work. We also have a 2-volume on Epicurus and a collection of documents related to the early history of the Epicurean school, which might conceivably have been Philodemus's working notes for his historiographic work. Further, there's an On Stoics that is not the same as the volume of the history of philosophy on the Stoics. He wrote several treatises on theology. We have an On Piety, On the Gods 1, so at least a 2nd book is missing. On the Lifestyle of the Gods, which apparently did not belong to the On the Gods series, On Piety and On Provenance, and the anonymous, or the untitled work that Marzia D'Angelo just published. A number of works on ethical topics survive. We have an On Anger, 2 books on wealth, on gratitude, on conversation, on choices and avoidances, and on frank speech, which belongs to yet another series called On Lifestyles. There are some trends, a lot of ethical works, a lot of geometry, weirdly. I am at a loss to explain that one. Not a lot of physics after Epicurus. I promised some guesses about what's likely to be in the scrolls that have not been unrolled yet. There are some difficulties with this kind of prognostication, most importantly, that we don't actually know how many rolls made up the collection. Gianluca Del Mastro's book on the titles of the Herculaneum papyri lists 118 papyri whose authors can be read in the subscriptions. This gives us something relatively solid to work from. It could be adjusted. So for instance, Philodemus's On Anger is not included in this because we can't read Philodemus's name on the papyrus. The book On Time, which is pretty firmly attributed to Epicurus, is also not included. So the numbers could waver a bit, but I'm sticking with what's legible on the papyrus. Philodemus's name can be read in 60 of the 118 titles in Del Mastro's catalog, just over 50%. Epicurus wrote 17 entries, or 14%. Chrysippus, with 4 titles, is about 3%. Those figures seem about right to me. Just add some mental error bars for cases of assigned texts rather than those with legible subscriptions, and we're pretty much in business. So that is to say, somewhat better than half of the still rolled up scrolls are likely to be by Philodemus. Epicurus will continue to bulk large. Stoic texts and Latin literature will likely be represented by a handful each. This is still a staggering amount of new material. If there are 150 rolls left to be digitally unrolled, that means 75 or 80 books by Philodemus. Right? We have the same problem with the still rolled up material that we do with the unrolled material, namely it's fragmentary and we don't know how many book rolls are actually represented in the fragments that we have. So 75 or 80 new books by Philodemus, about 25 by Epicurus, 4 or 5 new Stoic works, and maybe 6 new works of Latin literature. The rest will mostly be other Epicureans, and there will be some 1 in 100 rarities, like that Greek historical treatise that I mentioned. It's impossible to name specific books. I would guess that we're likely to find missing books in series that we have parts of, right? More of Epicurus's On Nature is going to show up, the missing books of Philodemus's On Vices, and so forth. Other works by the first generation seem pretty likely, considering how much of the collection they make up already. Epicurus was famous in antiquity for writing a lot, so probably we might find more of him than the statistics suggest. A working library with such old copies of some works is likely to have old copies of other works as well. I hope we'll find out very soon. Thank you for your attention.
Again, we have some time for questions. And then there's microphones.
Has there been any attempts to classify the scrolls of fragments by the scribe? They seem to be pretty identifiable. It is certain.
Yeah, so the basic work on that is by Cavallo, an Italian, called Libri Scrittore Scribi. And he identifies about 36 scribes. And then work on that has continued with material that Cavallo didn't take into account, especially by Gianluca Del Mastro. So yeah, we can identify scribes, and that helps us put together roles. Yeah.
So,
But
Tom's,
As the book, so you might like to do the book course, does that reveal then new information and lies for the record?
I'm sorry?
Has the historical book given any links to historical record?
Yes, so we learn quite a bit from the history of philosophy. That's the work that was in the news recently for giving us Plato's burial site, and that's a contested reading. It's not certain, but it does continue to teach us new things. That work specifically has been pretty well published in the past. There's a brand new edition by Killian Fleischer, which is pretty good, and it does give us some new details. But he's also building on I think 3 or 4 past editions. So a lot of what we learned from that work, we had known already. But yeah, it's still an important source.
Final question from Vesuvius. Oh,
so once upon a time, Simon Larsen gave a talk in Texas, talking about the length of time after Philodemus' death between that and the burial of Bill at the library. And then one of the things that he talked about was the question of which books of Epicurus' on nature survive, and which books of Epicurus on nature are cited by Philodemus, and they're almost entirely not overlapping. So the question then became, why did these books that Philodemus was less interested in apparently survive and the others not? And Simon thought that perhaps it was the case that since that they might have had some time before before they were all destroyed, they might have actually evacuated the books that were more important to them and left the others behind. What do you think about this whole question?
Yeah, why did they leave Philodemus' books behind if they took the books of the On Nature that were important to Philodemus?
Maybe they were important to everyone.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, so we know from Pliny that there were earthquakes and Vesuvius was spouting smoke for a while before the actual eruption happened. We know that papyri were found in boxes and loose on the floor and in various places in the villa. Maybe that's evidence that they were trying to box things up and get them out because they knew that Vesuvius, which they had not known previously was a volcano, but had just become immediately recognizable as a volcano, was likely to erupt. So my immediate reaction is that it doesn't really have the ring of truth to it. Yeah, I don't see a way immediately just standing here of refuting it, but it just doesn't seem very likely that they would be picking out, right, if you're panicking because the volcano is erupting, are you gonna grab book 1 and then leave 2 copies of book 2 and then grab book 3? You know, I don't know that you're gonna be that picky grabbing books off the library shelves.
let's thank Professor McOsker.